Hello, my name is John Brink and we are podcasting on the Brink for the forest industry in BC in transition is this program, and we are podcasting from downtown Prince George. In the background you see a beautiful day in Prince George, and if you wondered about it looks a bit smoky in the background, then that's because of the fires around us. And we have a guest today who can help us explaining some of those things to us. His name is Bruce Blackwell, and Bruce is a registered professional forester, RPF, has a degree in biology from the University of British Columbia, and has been involved in the industry and in forestry for the last 30 years or more. So welcome to the show, Bruce.
Nice to be here, John. Glad you invited me.
So tell us a little bit more about your background in the forest industry in particular and your specialties.
So it all started way back when in 1979. I was fortunate to be hired on the BC Provincial RAP Attack Team, a group of special firefighters that train to rappel out of helicopters and attack inaccessible firefighters. It was the second year of the program. At the time in university, I was very active in the outdoor club. I'd done a lot of hiking, climbing, and ski touring, and rappelling seemed exciting and something that I was interested in doing. And so I started there. I fought fires for a year, and then somebody told me, well, you might be interested in forestry, and that sort of lured me to go move from a biology degree program at UBC to a forestry degree program in UBC. I went on and fought fires for 2 more years. I worked with Jim Dunlop, who became the director of BC Wildfire Service at the time, helping to set up the Salmon Arm Camp, and started my degree in forestry. Did my degree from roughly, I think it was 1980 to 83. With some credits from the biology work that I'd done, and graduated in probably the worst time in forestry. Over the period of time up to that was a worldwide recession. I managed to get a summer job with Western Forest Products as a compassman, and we went up. I worked in Holberg that summer on the north of Vancouver Island, and I remember the president, Roger Manning, coming into the camp and saying, if this camp can't deliver 2,400 cubic meters of wood a day, we were shutting it down, and anybody on staff was going to be laid off. So that was an interesting period to start my career in forestry. And I finished working, and then the following summer, I had a couple of courses, and I worked for the Outdoor Recreation Council, building trails for job creation programs, like helping to manage a big $2.4 million project, which was kind of helped me learn a lot about the business of running crews and people and WCB and all the regulatory framework in BC. And then following that, there was no work for foresters in BC as a young graduate. I think maybe 2 of my class of 105 had found work. And an old professor that I'd had at UBC, Michael Feller, was the fire professor that I'd studied under as an undergrad. And I went to work for him grinding up wood samples for a summer, and running analysis on the chemistry of wood materials in his lab, some that had burned, some that hadn't burned, and helping. He had a water quality program that was ongoing at Maple Ridge. And I worked there for a summer, and then on and off for 6 months, and did a few other jobs. And then I guess FRBC came along, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And there was a research project up in Smithers to start looking at using prescribed burning to rehabilitate dense lodgepole pine, which you're also familiar with. And I asked, well, could I do a master's degree and work at UBC on this project? And it was sponsored by the BC Forest Service and UBC, and they said, yeah, why not? So I worked part-time at the lab, running samples, and part-time doing my master's degree. And it was a fascinating project because what we did was, in those days, the Lakes Forest District had many stands of fire origin, and those existed through the whole Prince George TSA, 20,000, 30,000 stems per hectare. They really weren't merchantable, and we were looking at a way to cheaply convert those stands from what was unmerchantable material to merchantable material using different burning techniques. So we knocked stands down with cats, just broadcast knockdown, and we windrowed them. And we created a number of different study areas, and we burned them under what we called low, very low, low, moderate, and high severity. And when I say high severity, we burned them in the middle of the summer under very hot conditions. In fact, the very first burns that we did that year were in June. And even though it was called a very low severity, 2 of my plots burned up. So I had to redesign my study area. But the goal of the study was, one, which was the best ecological treatment to reestablish a forest. So we looked at, and which mitigated hazard and removed the fuel. How did the fuel burn? So I got thrown to the fire, so to speak, about looking at all things fire ecology. And we looked at chemistry changes in the soil, chemistry changes in the ecosystem. We looked at revegetation. We looked at planting success and tree growth. I published 2 papers out of the work. And that sort of started me on a path where I met a number of people at UBC, including Carl Klinka and Reed Carter, and they gave me some opportunity to start consulting. So I actually never went out and got a job. I just started getting contracts to do consulting, and that all started between 1986 and 1988. I started my own business in a bedroom in a condominium that we purchased in North Van, and I grew it into my garage. And from my garage, I finally rented an office, and here I am today with about 30 people working for me, having been in business since 1988. So you would say that would be, what, 12, almost 35 years.
Yeah, unbelievable. Eh? And then the company's name is Blackwell and Associates, and that has especially in a number of areas, especially when you were explaining about this is all recent stuff, really. Like the changes that have taken place in terms of fire and technology around it as to how to deal with it, how to manage it better, and then considering for our public. And again, the people watching us on this podcast are from around the world for all intents and purposes. And it is in particular interesting for them to know BC, again, is the province, a lot of forest in BC, the same in Alberta for all intents and purposes. And when you started your early career with Western, it was mainly on the island initially. And then, obviously, going back to, or as you said, in fighting fires initially, was dangerous in the sense of jumping out of planes. So as soon as we identified, or somebody identified the fire, the planes would go in, try to put water or chemicals on it to put it out, and then at the same time drop persons in an area to manage it. It quite delicate and somewhat dangerous in a sense, right? So you had to be able to manage it all.
Yeah, I mean, fighting fires, back in the late 70s, early 80s and fighting fires in general is always an exciting job, but it is dangerous. But the interesting thing I've seen through my career is that, and when you follow the data, we became exceptionally good, internationally such, at putting fires out post World War II. Basically, after aircraft became available to fight fires, we had a 95% success rate in extinguishing fires. And those fires that got big didn't get anywhere near as big as they've been getting in the last 20. And so the most interesting part about that, And it started, the US is really about 30 years ahead of us because their fire suppression became more effective before ours did. And so I started looking to the US research when I graduated and started realizing that, you know, there was this problem in the US and why weren't we having it in BC? And another colleague and I, Bob Gray, investigated looking at changes in fuel types, changes in hazard on the landscape. And we managed to get funding in about 2003 and started to realize that our landscape had dramatically changed from the effects of fire suppression. We had higher numbers of trees. We had greater competition amongst trees, which led to more mortality and increases in fuel. And we had effectively removed fire from the landscape through two processes. When I first started in the business, we were burning about 500,000 hectares a year through broadcast burning following harvest. That through the 80s and early 90s was brought down to almost zero. So historically, the forest industry did a lot of burning. It was minimized to nothing. We had this combination of effective fire suppression, which really contributed significantly to the first big fire season, interface fire season in 2003, where Kelowna burned. Following Kelowna, we had a number of other fire seasons, but then we had the start of the mountain pine beetle had been brewing, but it also took off significantly after Kelowna, largely in my opinion because we had been so good at putting out fires that we'd allowed the pine to really merge into a homogeneous age class rather than a heterogeneous age class where disturbance had created different pockets of different ages. It became, you know, in an analogy, it was a geriatric population of pine that was susceptible to something like COVID, and that was the pine beetle. And the pine beetle effectively took out all that pine inventory and then has left us with a legacy of growing fuel problems, which we tried to mitigate by harvesting, but we still have some of that legacy left.
So in a sense then, Bruce, did we become too good at managing fires? Is the question. And so that all of a sudden where nature would deal with those issues, all of a sudden it couldn't. And then I remember well, 2003, it was that major firestorm, especially in West Bank and those areas close to Kelowna, that you know, had a very, very major impact because of weather, global warming issues, and all the other issues around management of the forest, and in particular as it relates to dealing with fires or potential fires or weeds and underbrush and all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we ended up with stands that had been maintained with frequent fire. And when I say frequent fire, fires that occurred anywhere from 2 to 40 years, repeated fires, that kept forests in an open forest condition.
Correct.
And a classic example would have been in the Caribou, where you would have had large Douglas fir trees, 150 to 250 stems per hectare, now having, you know, 3,000, 4,000, even 5,000 stems per hectare, small diameter, very close quarters, and they are now under the climate conditions that we have, very much susceptible to crown fires, and the landscape is homogeneous, and so those fires move relatively seamlessly across the landscape with no barriers. And
so, yeah, go ahead.
I think the other thing is the amount of fuel. I don't think people realize that taking fire out of the equation has created a tremendous amount of fuel on the landscape. It's you know, if you work with it, understanding how much has to come out to reduce the intensity of fire so that we have a chance to actually put out the fire is a huge challenge and very expensive.
And is it also maybe a question of the replanting that we do that used to be diverse in terms of not just the classic planting, but also involve other species and other mixtures. Aspen comes to mind, and all of those other things that would better manage the forest and protect it from fire, but also create a healthier forest?
Yeah, certainly we, through forest management practices, have focused on coniferous species that were commercially valuable,
Right.
and removed deciduous and other species that were less valuable. And the deciduous contributes to a buffering effect in fire, in the fact that it has a higher foliar moisture content,
Right.
and therefore is less flammable. Now, you can't say that about aspen per se in Alberta right now, because in the spring in Alberta, you have a winter, we call it a relative humidity dip. And usually what happens in May, before the trees leaf out, we get cold temperatures at night, hot temperatures at day. They suck the moisture out of the remaining fuels, particularly grass, which makes these areas susceptible to these large fires. Now, the one thing about Alberta fires at this time of the year, many of them are not necessarily lightning caused, many of them are human caused, compared to our really bad summer fires, which are a combination of lightning, human around 43%, lightning somewhere around 60%. So you've got different dynamics going on in Alberta compared to here. You will get coniferous fires in the boreal later in the summer in Alberta, but where you see these towns that are burning, and a lot of them have aspen around the fringes, and those are often the susceptible stands at this time of year.
Right. So if you look at that now so much, Bruce, and global warming being more and more of an issue in a general sense, that and then in the post pine beetle period of 15 years, if you wish, and are we doing anything now to manage better our forest as we go through all of that, through the midterm and to the forest looking forward, say 20, 30, 40 years? Will the forest look different because the way we managed it, in terms of making sure that the opportunities for fires and harvesting and beetles and all of those things are better managed?
So the short answer to your question is no. Our focus right now and all the energies around mitigation, prevention, largely the dollars are being spent on protecting communities, and to a lesser extent, maybe some important infrastructure, whether that's watersheds or transmission lines or infrastructure on the landscape. We have not, as of yet, been able to scale up where we are making what I would consider meaningful change to the broader landscape and the landscape that's important to our traditional forest industry, and the landscape that is not even included in our THLB. That landscape is still as vulnerable as it was, in my opinion, 20 years ago. And in fact, things are getting worse, because you well know in Prince George that you've had a significant spruce beetle outbreak. There's also been a significant Douglas fir bark beetle outbreak since the mountain pine beetle event. And these insect and disease problems are continuing to exacerbate the fuel problem around the province, to the point where basically, if we look at a simple metric of fire behavior, which we call head fire intensity, we have over 40 million hectares, or up to 40 million hectares, of high hazardous fuels across our forested landscape. So the problem is enormous. The problem is going to be tremendously expensive to deal with. And yet, I would say we have a long way to go.
Is it though, and you made references earlier in early 2000 You got funding through FRBC to do a project in terms of burning and what it would do. And I was on the board of FRBC, so I remember those things. We were already then as FRBC looking not only at industry, but also in terms of that precious resource that we have, the forest industry of British Columbia, both coast and interior, how to sustain it and to make sure that we did all the things we could do to create a healthier forest going forward. And I remember well the early 80s, 83, I think, we had a spruce beetle attack in the Barron Rivers, mainly because there was a blowdown in the Barron River Park that then spread very quickly through a whole big area, and as you were referring to. And then obviously that, again, for the benefit of our foreign and other people that maybe are not so familiar with it, which already was then considered to be probably the largest clear cut that you could see all the way from the satellites in sky.
Yeah.
Obviously that was dwarfed by the pine beetle attack early 2000, late 90s, and that lasted for 15, 16 years and still is not quite totally managed, but it's getting close to that. But it left a whole lot of fuel behind that is still an issue, correct?
That's correct. And I mean, BC is not unique to this problem. The beetle outbreak has occurred throughout the western US. We've seen beetle attacks and other insect outbreaks in Alaska. The beetle moved into Alberta, as you know, into parts of Saskatchewan, largely for similar reasons that I've discussed here. We have not only effectively taken fire out of BC ecosystems, but we've taken fire out of North American ecosystems, and even countries like Spain, countries like France, other parts of Europe, other parts of the world, Australia included, which I consider to be the fire continent, are all facing this same dilemma. The policy of fire suppression has led to more fuel, which under the climate regime that we're moving to is much more susceptible. Let's just say the probability of a fire ignition is going up. And because we have so much fuel, the probability of a catastrophic fire where we can't control fire behavior is also going up. So the thing you've seen in the last 20 years is not only have we had more fires, but we've had fires that we've been unable to control with the technologies that we have, and they've grown out of control and burned into communities, burned up infrastructure and valuable social, economic, and environmental parts of the landscape that we're not able to protect because there's just too much fuel there.
And so if I hear on the news, which we do on a daily basis right now because of all the things that are happening in Alberta, and then in BC, I think we got 80 fires, which relatively speaking, compared to Alberta, where they have double or triple that, and a lot of them are either under control or not under control. The frequency of that occurring will likely increase as we go forward as a combination of global warming in combination with fuel that is available on the ground. Now, on the fuel side, the other thing that's never been quite clear to me, obviously some of it is human, the other one is because of lightning, but there are also situations where there may be ignition sources that are right below the surface and may be there for years already.
Well, I mean, we do have what we call hangover fires. So you're well aware that industry has burn piles as a method of hazard mitigation. What we've seen is, you know, if we light those piles sometime in the fall or early winter, they get hot enough and they burn down in through roots into the ground. And even though there's no oxygen there, that the combustion becomes anaerobic as they smolder. And then what happens is, because we've had such dry wind, or we've had dry springs or low snowpacks and droughts immediately, like we're seeing right now after winter, these smoldering pockets come back to the surface and start fuels on the surface on fire. And so we've seen that from large landscape wildfires, that the next season we get fires coming back the following season. And we've been seeing, certainly in the last, well, I would say since 2016, 2015, I've been involved in a lot of litigation of these hangover fires that have occurred either on public lands or they've occurred on private lands, where it is the obligation of either the licensee or the private landholder to extinguish these fires. And if they do come back as a hangover fire, and if they do result in significant damage, there's legislation focused on cost recovery, where the government looks to cover its costs for firefighting, and these can be significant costs.
So that then being said, and where we are now, just for the public, because it's so timely that you are one of the experts in Western Canada, if not in Canada, in regards to fires and all the things that we are talking about, the situation that is all around us right now. For the people that are listening to us, are we still early in the season? Is it, we're listening on a daily basis, and I look around us here and I see smoke. Will it be a summer, and you can't predict the weather going forward, but it's an early start, right? Is the forest dry, or are the conditions right for fire the way things are right now?
So every year, John, somebody asks me to play God and tell them what the fire season is.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
So I don't have my Bible today, and I haven't gone to church and prayed to get the right direction. But I will tell you this: it's exceptionally dry still. People aren't aware. Last fall was very, very dry.
Exactly.
From August through to the end of October.
Right.
And that drought really hasn't been recharged over the winter. So I do a lot of skiing at Whistler. Normal snowpack in Whistler is usually around 400 centimeters. We had 250 centimeters. So most of the province, even though we've got this flood risk, lots of areas didn't get as much recharge as they would have normally through rain and through snow. The other thing that's going on, and it's going on in other parts of the world, is that the temperature right now is particular to this movement this weekend and the past little while in Alberta, is we're almost in what I'd call a spring heat dome. It's similar to the heat dome we had in June in 2021, but it's just earlier in the year. And so this week, this week in Vancouver, I think by Saturday and Sunday, we're looking at temperatures of 28, 29 degrees. The interior is looking in the 30s. These are temperatures we wouldn't usually see until the end of June.
Right.
Interestingly enough, I just was in India for a month, and they have a very similar phenomena going on right now. This is not their summer. This is their late spring, and they had temperatures in the 40s, which are normally what they get in their summer months. And they're forecasting there that they could have temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees C.
Right.
Which really is unbelievable to think of. But the phenomena that really drives whether we have a difficult fire season in BC or not is how much rain we get in June. Right. Now, if we get a lot of rain in June, we typically won't have a significant fire season. Last year was like that. We had big rainy period in May and June, and really the fire season never got a chance to ramp up until very late August, and was active August, September because of the drought, but not as active as it would have been because day length was reduced, relative humidity started coming back because of a longer night period. But when we have a dry period like we've got right now, we don't get any rain in the spring or in June, I would say, look out, this could be worse than anything we've seen.
Right.
But I'm not going to predict where we're going.
No.
All I'm going to say, though, is if you look at the long-term forecast to the end of the month, there is very little precipitation coming through the next few weeks in May. It'll really come down to, okay, how many fire starts do we get with this heat wave? Do we get enough rain to extinguish them? And what do things look like beginning of July? The other thing I'll say is that it becomes more and more difficult for the for wildfire service. The more fires they get, the more resources are spread out, and these early fires won't go away now. So they're going to tie up resources right through the whole fire season, cost a lot of money just to hold them, and draw resources down from the initial attack of future more difficult fires. So all of these things, if you look at Alberta right now, there's firefighters coming from BC, today the Yukon, Quebec, Ontario.
All over.
It becomes a long fire season for all these people.
Yeah.
And they tire out, they need rest, and these things, it's a mounting, like it's kind of like a snowball.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So hopefully, we get rain in June, and but it will always be a challenge, right? Yeah. That being said, just shifting over a little bit to other things. Both you and me have been in the forest industry for a long time. You for 30 years when you left the university and then decided to go in the direction of a specialty, becoming a registered professional forester, worked for Western, and then became quite involved in the coast, but also you became involved in the interior and became knowledgeable about the interior. I think we met the first time, not directly, but indirectly. I was quite involved in early 2000 and developing a project that was the fuel pellets were relatively new to the industry, and I was in negotiations with a company from Sweden. What was the name of the company again?
Tall Oil.
Tall Oil. For a plant here in Prince George, but not only in Prince George, in a number of other areas. And I had already a property here of 100 acres, and we're starting to build a sawmill, especially for the purposes of the pine beetle. And Tall Oil secured a number of licenses that were pine beetle attacked licenses for building a pellet plants.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the fire side was one thing, but one of the things since the early 2000s that I saw we needed to start focusing on is what could we do with all this waste wood and this small diameter material to get it off the landscape, to start thinking about mitigating these fires. The beetle came along, and basically a group of Swedish folks, Henrik, I can't remember his last name, but it doesn't come to me right now, my brain. But anyway, very interesting fellow from Sweden who had been in the pelletizing business in Sweden.
Yes. Decided
this was a great place to come. There was a great resource here, and if he could get access to it, he could build an international business. They secured 3 heavily damaged pine beetle licenses, one in Quesnel, one in the Williams Lake TSA, and one in Prince George. I think about 3 million cubic meters.
Correct.
And then worked with companies like you, the Fair Group in Prince George, with the idea of building a whole series of pellet plants. I think the original concept was 5 or 6.
Correct.
There was sort of 2 divisions. We worked on the timber procurement, timber layout and processing part, and others were working on securing rail siding infrastructure and actually building the plants. And that went on basically till 2008, till the crash came in 2008, and they got into trouble with they had money, but the problem was they had an international finance agreement that the Swedish financiers were uncomfortable supporting in a global recession, and the whole thing fell apart.
Correct.
But in my mind, it was before its time. It was the infancy of talking about pellets in BC, and it was challenging because the government was having difficulty supporting this direction. But I mean, you know, and there's lots of controversy with pellets even today. But I think it would have created an opportunity to utilize a lot more of this fiber that has burned either in fires or is still lying on the ground.
Yes, and then the other part about it was in 1975 I started a value-added company here in Prince George, and that was one of the extensions that I was interested in, is not only doing the value-added, but then when the pine beetle epidemic happened, is seeing that as an opportunity to create a specialty sawmill in combination with pellet manufacturers, and that building into a business that had continuity and still would have been viable today, as we have seen. And you know, it was then the government that was at the time in BC very proactive and kind of stimulating that area.
Yeah, well, I mean, the beauty of it is you're utilizing the dead material in the stand, and you're utilizing the green. Whereas the economics, in some cases where there's too much dead material, there isn't enough opportunity to go in there and merchantly harvest that greenwood. So it made timber available that otherwise wouldn't have been available. So it added a lot of benefits to the industry as a whole. At least a number of us could see that.
And then the other part about it, Bruce, was that, and it's no different than it is right now, because even then, and if I look back all the way, is that it still has always been an industry in transition, really. You know, and the names of the buildings have changed. Obviously, pine beetle and fires to a certain extent in 18 and 19, when we had a lot of fires here in the interior. But a lot of the pine beetle, obviously, you know, had to be managed, and the companies did very well by uplifts in the annual allowable cut from 60 million cubic meters annually to as high as 80 or beyond. And everybody was doing great because the timber was cheap, relatively speaking. It weighed lots of timber based on the weight of the timber. And then obviously that had to be, after the pine was gone or nearly gone, or the economic viability of it, we all of a sudden ended up with adjustments that had to be made to the annual allowable cut, where today we are probably somewhere between 35 and 40 million cubic meters annually. 35 to 40 sawmills have shut down, 6-7 pulp mills, a number of pellet plants, and a whole lot of secondary manufacturers. And all of a sudden we are back into an industry in transition where the main tenure holders in the interior in particular, the 5 largest ones, control about 75% of the AEC, but which in fact, if you control 75%, you control likely 100% by simply having the major portion of it. But a lot of them have, because of economic reasons, moved into other areas, maybe the US Southeast or to Sweden. So and then the other thing that changed a whole lot of things that you are quite familiar with is that First Nations, through partially litigation and because of adjustments that have been made, have got rights to timber allocations that represent right now probably 12 or 13% of the annual allowable cut, likely going higher, and a portion of the revenue already, but not in short-term licenses, but rather in really owning that portion of the fiber, which again, between pine beetle, changes to the annual allowable cut because of partially First Nations. The other one is because of the old growth deferral portion. major changes have taken place in the forest industry from a operational perspective, but also in terms of what will happen now next. And as we go through what we call the midterm of sizable reductions in annual allowable cut, how can we, my question is, how can we stimulate to grow more fiber per hectare? How can we better manage the forest for reasons that we just have talked about, fires and making sure, but also in thinning and managing so that we can, no different than they do in Sweden, where we can, on our ground base, probably grow double the amount of fiber per hectare. And then the other one is, and I talk a lot here, so bear with me, but what I'm saying is we have to go from a culture of trying to be the lowest cost of 2x4 producers for the world to add more value, social and economic value, to this precious resource that we have. And I believe as we go forward in the industry, 5, 10, 15, 20, sooner, in my opinion, than later, it should be that the industry will come back, will build new mills that are smaller, more technology, employ a lot less people, and likely up to 50% of the lumber manufactured in those mills will go up the value chain. 25% of the lower grades, 25% of the higher grades. But we don't want to be the lowest 2x4 or the lowest producer of cost 2x4 producers for the world. We have to change in a different direction.
And I don't disagree with any of those things that you said. I think I'll add a couple. I think that there is an opportunity, and I know there's someone innovative out there, whether it's Bill Gates or somebody, who can think about utilizing this small diameter material. And when I'm talking small diameter, I'm talking 15 centimeters or lower, whether we grind it up, we make it into fiberboard. I think there's a huge opportunity in this mass timber business, mass timber like Structure Lamb, unfortunately going through this receivership. But you know what Kolesnikov is doing in their mill in the Kootenays, I think there's huge opportunities in those areas. I think we need a policy framework that's different than we currently have.
And that's the point.
Yeah. And from my perspective, on a policy basis, we have to reinvent stumpage, we have to reinvent tenure, and we need to think about how we grow and manage the forest differently, and that's being done. There's some work being done on that and changing FERPA, but I don't see changes in tenure and stumpage that need to happen.
Well, and I agree with you. And what I'm simply saying as well, Bruce, is that to have forest policy or to have governments, which we have here, and that's all good. Every 4 years there may be somebody else, and every 2 years there is a different minister of forest and everything. That has to change. You must have agreed between the different stakeholders, which is we the government own the timber, but so do First Nations now, and that together they have to develop policies that are not subject to changes in, with all due respect to the Minister of Forest, but simply because something changes in politics, we have to go forward with the objective, this is what we want to accomplish in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and it's not subject to a politician coming in and simply because they're being lobbied by one, the other, and all of a sudden everything changed. We saw that in early 2003. We've seen it in both governments, left, right, and the other one. But I believe, now, you know, and I want to make this point, is that when I came here in 1965 from Holland, I was trained as a furniture maker. I worked in the lumber industry in Holland. Even then, I was 24 years old when I came here with a dream. I was going to build. We were liberated by the Canadian Army. On April the 12th, 1945, it left such an impression on me that I always knew from that point forward I would go to the land of my heroes. It was not when or if or when. And my dad managed the small lumber companies, and my other dream was to build my own lumber mill. And so when I came off the bus here, about 3 blocks away, all I had is 1 suitcase, 1 set of clothes, 3 books, and I had $25.47 in my pocket. I counted it 3 times. I couldn't speak the language. I didn't know a soul, and I didn't have a job. But I knew I would build a lumber mill. And my passion has always been, I couldn't believe what we were doing. I looked at the burners, and half the tree was going up the burner. The way it went in my life is that if I was in the mill of where my dad worked, if I stepped on a piece of lumber, they would put me in the back, because you have to respect the lumber. And the other part, one more point I was going to make, I get so passionate about this, but the other point that I was going to make is that when I came in 1965, lodgepole pine was a weed. Nobody wanted it.
Yes.
And that went right into the 70s. And then they became opportunity licenses. And then we went further. It was not all that long ago, I think in the early 80s, I applied for a small timber license between Fort St. James and Vanderhoof, which was an opportunity license because it was small spruce. So the point that you're making is absolutely correct. It does not, with all due respect, it does not take Bill Gates to figure out what we have to do with the small timber. We know what we have to do with it. You know, that we got pulp mills sitting here that obviously the cheapest for them is to access residuals from sawmills. But if there is not enough, then we have to find a way in which we can harvest that fiber and then put that either into pulp or whatever we do, or create a different industry for it. But there is value in that particular fiber that is left behind. And it is no different than lodgepole pine was in the 60s and was a weed. And became the premium product. There's no reason for us to leave that fiber behind in the bush.
I don't disagree. And I think one of the things I've been more proud in my career in the last 20 years is that I have helped advise and support Hawaiian First Nations on the coast. And when I started working with them, their tenure is in Port Alberni, and they were on McMillan Liddell's Tree Farm License 44. And they used to submit red, green, and yellow letters. Robert Dennis, the chief, if he was concerned about them logging some part of their cultural areas or areas of concern, he would submit a red letter, and he would submit a green letter if it was okay to cut. Well, that relationship has dramatically changed over the last 25 years. Hawaii got treaty. They have a core treaty area that's within TFL 44, and I'm proud to say we helped negotiate 3 licenses, roughly about 100,000 plus cubic meters that they started their own business with. And just in the last 2 years, Hawaii First Nations has formed a partnership, a limited company with Western Forest Products called Sawakin, where they're a shareholder in that company and working alongside Western to develop new and important industry in the Port Alberni Valley. I see that as the future. I see that as where we need to go to be successful, along with technology and along with all the things we've talked about. I'm like you. My father came here from Scotland in 1954 with not a lot of money, started his own business, was very successful, retired, I think, about age 55. And I learned from him, hard work in this country can get you places. Thinking, working hard, and taking advantage of the resources that are here, what really has built this province. And I think a little bit of that is, we've lost sight of a little bit of that. And we need to refocus. We've got a huge landscape restoration project ahead of us. And I think that it needs to be thought of both as an economic opportunity and as a social, and a fundamentally critical social project that we need to undertake to rehabilitate this landscape and minimize the impacts of the change that's occurred over the last 20 years to communities, to other resources that we value, and to the benefit of British Columbians. And I'm passionate about that.
And so am I. And to make sure that the social and economic value of that flows back to the public in British Columbia. And what I'm saying is access to timber is a privilege. With that go certain social obligations. And I'm not being critical of anybody in particular, but what I'm saying now is that the same as you do, when I first came here, I started cleanup man, lumber pilot, and all the other things, but I was then already in a hurry. And within a year and a half, I was the superintendent of one of the larger mills here, and that didn't go fast enough for me. And then I got an offer to become a general manager of a sawmill, and you know, and with the condition that if I stayed there for 5 years, I would own 1/3 of the sawmill. And the sawmill was in Watson Lake, Yukon.
So I'll tell you a story. I started fighting fires in Lower Post.
Well, you may. Well, that and actually that's interesting that you say that, because I was there for 5 years, and in early '72s when I left, they started clearing around the town of Watson Lake because you know, for worried about wildfires and all of those kind of things. But the other point that I was going to make, Bruce, is that at that sawmill we employed 100% or nearly 100% First Nations. And I brought one sawyer with me here from Prince George, that an old-timer that was my sawyer there. And I ran the mill there successfully in Watson Lake, then came back here and started Brink Forest Products with nothing and 3 employees with a whole new concept. And whenever you have time, stop by my mill and I give you a tour. But I have this passion about the value-added sector. I believe we can do more of it. And I get upset with the industry when they don't seem to see that, or are not being, I believe, not being as proactive about it as they should be, because that's the direction it will go. And I say the same to First Nations. I work with them. I've always worked with First Nations. I see that as they now have access to the timber, is go to the next step. Look for how much further can you go. Work with people that have your benefit as well in mind. And then the other part that I believe here in Northern BC in particular is we have to have, you know, the access to a skilled workforce is critical. And we here should build a center of excellence, no different, not quite to the same size as BCIT. Actually, I committed $1 million to that already 3-4 years ago. And that unless we have access to a skilled workforce, it will be difficult to attract capital, not only for the forest industry, but in a general sense for developing of Northern BC. And I say the other part as well. I love Canada, I love BC, I fly a lot, I always sit by the window, and every time I look out of the window, I say it's paradise. It is paradise. And then, you know, and that's how I feel about it.
Well, it's interesting because I've had a privilege working in this industry. Recently, our company got the contract to map the Great Bear Rainforest for ecosystems.
Wow.
And I spent 8 summers, 2 to 3 weeks each summer, flying in a helicopter, mapping the coast of British Columbia. And I can tell you, I've been all over the world. I just came back from India. And I have never, it's, people don't understand what we have in this province.
No.
Not enough people go out there and look at it. It is beyond amazing.
I agree.
And we are blessed, and we have a management obligation to do the best we can to protect this resource and manage it appropriately for the benefit of all British Columbians. I believe that.
And it's people like you and me that is our passion. We will push that forward. I'm going to make sure I send you a copy of my book, Against All Odds, and that's basically about not so much hurrah, hurrah, John, how well he did, but more about, in spite of all the things that have happened, the challenges all along the way. It took me 80 years to live it, 20 years to think about it, and then 2 years to write it. Quite good. I will send you a copy of it and sign it. This other one is, you know, as I already told you, I'm ADHD and proud of it. I call it the superpower. And I've been very vocal about it, in particular in the last number of years. Academically, I was not very successful. I failed grade 3, I failed grade 7 3 times. And then they said, well, do we send him to the mentally challenged school or do we get him a job? Fortunately, I love my parents then. You know, they sent me to become a furniture maker. And that still benefits me today. And, you know, so, but I speak about this in all different locations. Very successful book. And I'm going to send you a copy of this one as well. And then I wrote another, I want to write a book every year as long as I can. And so the next book is coming out in July. And it's precisely what you and me were talking about in our podcast. Finding your passion, living the dream. And that's coming out in July. And I'm going to send you a copy of that as well.
I look forward to reading them all.
Bruce, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, John. I appreciate the opportunity.
And we'll stay in touch.
Absolutely. Take care.
Take care, you too.